Welcome back to the deep dive. We often take for granted the very idea of belief. Like, what does it even mean to believe something? But then you come across a topic like delusion, and it just flips the script on everything. You've shared this incredibly in-depth entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on delusion, and I gotta say, it really gets into the weeds on this stuff. So today, I'm hoping we can extract the most crucial points, the real gems, particularly for someone who wants to have a deep philosophical conversation about this kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, the Stanford piece really goes deep, covering everything from the clinical aspects of delusion to its significance in philosophy and psychology. It looks at how delusions affect our thoughts and actions, how they challenge our very notion of what's real, and the various ways we try to understand them through different theoretical lenses. And honestly, what's striking is just how much debate there is, even among experts, about what a delusion actually is.
Right. It's not just a matter of memorizing a definition from a textbook. We're diving into those really thorny philosophical questions that delusions raise. Like, are delusions actually a type of belief or are they something else entirely? And if they are beliefs, what makes them so different, so unshakable compared to our everyday beliefs? Plus, I'm really curious about how delusions relate to things like, self-deception, which we all do to some extent, and the whole phenomenon of conspiracy theories, which seem to be more and more prevalent these days. So, our goal here is to really grapple with those philosophical nuts and bolts to understand those points of contention between different schools of thought.
Precisely. Think about how we typically understand beliefs. We form beliefs based on evidence, we use them to guide our actions, and they generally fit within our overall understanding of how the world works. But then you encounter delusions, these beliefs that are so rigid, so resistant to contradictory evidence, that they actually reshape someone's reality. It's like, how can someone believe something so strongly, even when all the evidence points in the opposite direction? That's the mind-boggling paradox of delusion, and it forces us to re-examine some of our most basic assumptions about the mind, about rationality, about what it means to be human, really.
It's like looking into a distorted mirror, right? And it's not just a psychological curiosity. The Stanford entry highlights how significant delusions are for philosophy itself. It's like they throw a wrench into our neat theories of how the mind works.
It's exactly. Delusions are a real goldmine for philosophers of mind and psychology. They challenge us to rethink core concepts. For example, take the idea of intentionality, the notion that our thoughts are about something, that they have a target. When someone experiences a delusion of control, you know, feeling like their thoughts are being broadcast or inserted by some external force, it raises profound questions about agency and free will. Like, what does it even mean to have control over your own thoughts, your own mental life?
It's as if someone's messing with the controls in your mind, and you're powerless to stop it. It really makes you ponder that whole connection between what we perceive, what we think, how we feel, and what we end up doing. It's like this intricate web, and delusions just tangle it all up.
You got it. And studying how these unusual beliefs form can actually shed light on how normal, non-delusional beliefs develop. It raises that age-old question. Do our beliefs shape our experience of the world, or do our experiences shape our beliefs? Is it a top-down or a bottom-up process? With delusions, it's this chicken and egg problem that's really tough to disentangle. It's like, do these bizarre beliefs arise from some fundamental distortion in perception, or are they attempts to make sense of a world that already feels distorted?
And this leads us to the first big hurdle in the Stanford entry, which is defining what a delusion actually is. It sounds like there's no easy answer, even within the field of psychiatry.
You're absolutely right. The definition of delusion is incredibly controversial. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, offers a standard definition: a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality, held firmly despite contradictory evidence and not culturally accepted. But philosophers have pointed out some real problems with this. For example, what if a belief happens to be true, but the person arrived at it through completely irrational means? Could that still be considered a delusion?
So the content of the belief isn't the only thing that matters. The way it's formed and maintained also plays a role.
Exactly. And then there's the question of whether delusions are always beliefs. Some argue they might be more like extremely vivid imaginings that the person struggles to distinguish from reality. And the DSM focuses on external reality and incorrect inference. But what about delusions about one's own body, like the Cotard delusion where someone believes they're dead or decaying? Or delusions about the identity of loved ones, like Capgras? These don't always fit neatly into the category of beliefs about the external world. And what about situations where an entire cultural group holds a belief that seems demonstrably false to outsiders? Can shared cultural beliefs ever be considered delusional? These edge cases really highlight the limitations of any rigid definition.
It's like trying to nail down a cloud, right?
Hmm.
Delusions seem to have so many facets, and context seems to matter so much that finding a one-size-fits-all definition might be impossible.
I think that's a key takeaway from the Stanford entry. It suggests that maybe we should think of delusion as more of a cluster of features rather than a single, clearly defined entity. The entry also explores what makes a delusion pathological. What sets it apart from just an unusual or strongly held belief? Is it the sheer level of irrationality? Or is it that the person seems to be living in their own private reality, unable to connect with others on a shared understanding of the world? The fact that delusions can have serious consequences for someone's well-being, their relationships, their ability to function in society, and even their legal standing definitely adds to the complexity. And of course, the question of whether delusions stem from some kind of underlying brain dysfunction is central to understanding why we consider them pathological.
So we've established that delusion is this incredibly complex phenomenon, and even defining it is a challenge. Now, let's delve into how different theories attempt to explain where delusions come from.
Absolutely. The Stanford entry gives us a really comprehensive overview of various theoretical approaches, and it's important to understand the historical shift in thinking. We used to draw a sharp distinction between functional delusions, supposedly rooted in psychological factors, and organic delusions linked to brain damage or disease, but nowadays the consensus is that all delusions have a biological basis, even if we haven't always been able to pinpoint the exact neural mechanisms involved.
So the old idea that some delusions are purely in the mind and others purely in the brain is no longer valid.
Exactly. While early psychodynamic theories focused on things like unconscious conflicts, repressed emotions, and defense mechanisms, for instance, suggesting that persecutory delusions might stem from projecting one's own aggressive impulses onto others, the rise of neuropsychiatry has emphasized the role of brain function. Take Capgras delusion again, the belief that a loved one has been replaced by an imposter. Purely psychological explanations, like those focusing on unresolved childhood issues, have been largely dismissed because we now know that brain damage affecting facial recognition can play a crucial role. However, the entry also acknowledges that for some delusions, especially those with a clear self-serving or defensive quality, we still need to consider how psychological factors might interact with underlying neurobiology to fully understand the phenomenon.
It's like a nature and nurture interplay in the brain, shaping how we perceive and interpret reality. Now let's get into those more contemporary theories mentioned in the entry. One factor, two factor, and prediction error theories. What are the key differences between them?
Okay, let's break them down. One-factor theories, like those proposed by Marr, present a pretty radical idea that the delusion itself might actually be a reasonable, albeit false, interpretation of a genuinely bizarre or unusual experience. In other words, the sheer strangeness of the initial perception or feeling is enough to trigger the delusion. However, this raises the question of why most people who have unusual experiences don't develop full-blown delusions. Gerons offers a slightly modified one-factor view, suggesting that while forming a delusional explanation initially might be understandable, the real problem is the inability to let go of that explanation when confronted with contradictory evidence. Interestingly, some recent proponents of the one-factor model argue that people who develop delusions might not even have any underlying cognitive deficits, implying that delusion formation might be a part of normal, albeit flawed, reasoning processes.
So it's like they have this strange experience, come up with an explanation to make sense of it, and then get stuck in that explanation no matter what. But what about all the evidence they encounter that contradicts their belief?
That's where two-factor theories come into play. They argue that you need two things for a delusion to develop. First, that unusual experience or faulty perception, and second, some kind of reasoning bias or cognitive deficit that prevents the person from properly evaluating the experience and revising their belief. Take Capgras delusion again. The first factor could be a reduced emotional response when seeing familiar faces, creating a sense of unfamiliarity or wrongness. The second factor could be a difficulty in evaluating this feeling, maybe a tendency to jump to conclusions or a bias towards explanations that feel complete or satisfying, even if they're highly improbable. Some two-factor models emphasize not so much the initial formation of the belief, but the failure to update or abandon it when new information comes in.
It's like the brain gets locked into a particular interpretation even when all the alarm bells are going off, signaling that something's not right.
Yep. Exactly. And McKay, who's done a lot of work on the two-factor theory, talks about this bias towards explanatory adequacy. It's like the person adopts the imposter hypothesis because it provides a neat and tidy explanation for why their loved one feels different, even if that explanation is incredibly far-fetched.
It's like choosing the most dramatic storyline, even when there are simpler, more plausible explanations available. Now, what about the prediction error theory? That one sounds really interesting and kind of cutting edge in terms of neuroscience.
It is. This theory draws on the framework of predictive coding, which suggests that our brains are constantly making predictions about the world and comparing those predictions to the sensory information we receive. When there's a mismatch, it creates a prediction error signal, prompting the brain to adjust its internal model of reality. In the context of delusion, the idea is that this prediction error signaling might be disrupted, possibly due to problems with certain neurotransmitters like dopamine. So when someone experiences something unexpected, say, they see their spouse, but don't feel that familiar emotional connection, the brain might overreact to this error, leading to a delusional explanation as a way to resolve the discrepancy and restore a sense of order. It's like the brain is desperately trying to make sense of a world that suddenly feels off-kilter.
So it's like the brain's error correction system goes haywire and it ends up creating a whole new reality to explain away the glitch.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. The Stanford entry also touches on the distinction between bottom-up and top-down theories of delusion formation. Bottom-up theories propose that the unusual sensory experience or perception is what drives the delusional belief. In contrast, top-down theories suggest that pre-existing beliefs can actually shape how we perceive and interpret the world, leading to the delusion. For example, someone with a pre-existing belief that they're being persecuted might interpret neutral comments or events as threatening. Now, the prediction error framework kind of blurs this distinction because it involves a constant interplay between our expectations top-down and the sensory data we receive bottom-up. And within the bottom-up camp, there's even a debate about whether the delusional belief is primarily an attempt to explain the unusual experience or whether it's more like an endorsement of an experience that already feels inherently delusional.
It's fascinating how all these different perspectives try to capture this really slippery phenomenon. So we've got this complex landscape of theories, and the very definition of delusion is still up for debate. Now, the Stanford entry introduces this concept of the continuity thesis, which sounds like it's trying to bridge the gap between delusions and other types of beliefs or thought processes.
Right. The continuity thesis argues that there might not be a clear categorical distinction between delusions and other kinds of irrational beliefs that we see in everyday life, or even some normal cognitive quirks. Instead, it suggests that delusions might represent extreme points on a spectrum of belief and reasoning. This idea is explored through three main questions. Are delusions inherently irrational? Are they truly beliefs in the first place? And do they share significant overlaps with things like self-deception and belief in conspiracy theories?
Let's start with the rationality question. The DSM characterizes delusions as irrational, but it sounds like some philosophers are pushing back on that view.
That's right. Maher, for example, argued that delusions might not be irrational in the sense that they can be understandable responses to genuinely bizarre experiences. The problem, he suggested, lies more in the subsequent resistance to changing those beliefs when confronted with contradictory information. However, the entry points out that even if the initial formation of a delusion could be seen as a flawed attempt at reasoning, the sheer tenacity with which people cling to those beliefs, often constructing elaborate and unconvincing justifications to maintain them, points to some kind of breakdown in rational thought processes.
It's like they build this fortress around their belief, and any evidence that threatens that fortress is either ignored or twisted to fit within their worldview. The entry mentions that striking example of the woman who was convinced she was receiving secret messages through license plates.
Yeah, she had this whole system for interpreting these messages, but it's clearly not a form of evidence that would persuade most people, and she was completely unwilling to entertain any other interpretation. The entry also highlights that delusions can sometimes be inconsistent with other beliefs the person holds, or they might not act in ways you'd expect if they truly believed what they claim to believe. For example, someone with Capgras delusion might intellectually acknowledge that the person in front of them is their spouse, but still feel emotionally distant and treat them like an imposter. However, It's crucial to note that delusions can and often do drive actions, sometimes with tragic consequences, as in the case of individuals who harm themselves or others based on their delusional beliefs.
It's like this disconnection between what they say they believe, how they feel, and what they actually do. It really underscores how complex and multifaceted this phenomenon is. Now, what do we learn from empirical studies that actually examine reasoning processes in people who experience delusions? Does that give us any clues about their rationality?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on this. Studies have found that individuals with delusions often exhibit specific reasoning biases. They might show a jumping to conclusions bias, where they form firm conclusions based on very little evidence. They might struggle to inhibit or disregard sensory information that contradicts their beliefs. They might display attribution biases, such as attributing negative events to external forces or conspiracies. And they might have a higher need for closure, meaning they feel a strong urge to have definitive answers, even when the evidence is ambiguous. Now, the debate among researchers is whether these biases represent a qualitatively different way of reasoning compared to the kinds of irrationality we all exhibit sometimes, or whether it's simply a matter of degree that people with delusions just have these biases to a more extreme extent. Some researchers have even tried to model delusion formation using Bayesian models of reasoning, suggesting that in certain contexts, the highly improbable explanation might actually be the most rational one, given the person's prior beliefs and the available evidence. The real puzzle, then, is why those beliefs aren't updated or revised when new information comes along.
So, even if there's a kind of twisted logic to how a delusion initially forms, the way it's maintained seems to be where things really go off the rails in terms of typical rational thought.
Exactly. The Stanford entry ultimately suggests that while delusions might be more irrational than everyday irrational beliefs, they might not be irrational in a fundamentally different way, which supports the continuity thesis, the idea that delusions lie on a spectrum with other types of beliefs and reasoning.
Okay, so delusions might just be really, really entrenched irrational beliefs. But the next part of the continuity thesis asks an even more radical question. Are delusions truly beliefs in the first place? That sounds like a mind-blowing concept.
It is. While the dominant view in psychology and psychiatry is that delusions are indeed beliefs, they're often reported with a strong sense of conviction and can certainly influence behavior. There's a growing philosophical perspective that challenges this assumption. Some argue that focusing solely on the belief aspect misses crucial experiential, phenomenological, and even social dimensions of delusion. They suggest that delusions might be more like deeply felt convictions that encompass not just thoughts, but also emotions, bodily sensations, and ways of relating to the world of other people.
So if delusions aren't just beliefs, what are they? The entry mentions things like acts of imagination or even a kind of alternate reality.
Some theorists propose that delusions might be more akin to vivid imaginings that the person mistakenly takes to be real. Others suggest they constitute what's called delusional realities, fundamental shifts in how someone experiences things like familiarity, agency, and their overall sense of self and the world. Those who argue against the delusions as beliefs view often point to the fact that delusions often lack integration with the person's other beliefs. They're resistant to counter-evidence, and they don't always guide behavior in a consistent or predictable way. However, proponents of the doxastic view, the view that delusions are indeed beliefs, counter that these criticisms rely on an overly idealized picture of what normal beliefs are like. Even non-delusional beliefs can be inconsistent, resistant to certain kinds of evidence, or not always acted upon in a way that reflects the belief. This debate ultimately hinges on whether the ways in which delusions differ from typical beliefs are so profound that they disqualify them from being categorized as beliefs at all. And for a philosopher, this is really exciting stuff because it forces us to refine our very understanding of what it means to have a belief.
It really highlights how our everyday assumptions about the mind can be shaken up when we encounter something as unusual as delusion. Now, the last aspect of the continuity thesis is the comparison of delusions to self-deception and belief in conspiracy theories. These are comparisons we hear a lot, especially these days.
Yeah, those comparisons are everywhere, and they're not always helpful or accurate. The traditional view is that self-deception is motivated. We deceive ourselves because we want to believe something, whereas delusions are primarily driven by neuropsychological factors. However, the Stanford entry points out that motivation can play a role in some delusions, particularly in shaping their content and influencing how they're maintained. There are arguments for a genuine overlap between self-deception and delusion. Both can involve a biased way of processing information to protect a cherished belief. Some even see certain delusions, like anosognosia, the denial of illness or disability, as extreme, perhaps even temporarily adaptive forms of self-deception. And the very existence of delusions, where someone can seemingly hold contradictory ideas without recognizing the conflict, has been used to support certain theories of self-deception that emphasize this ability to compartmentalize our beliefs.
So while there are clear differences, there might be some shared mechanisms at play in how we deceive ourselves and how delusions take hold.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to conspiracy theories, the comparison to delusion is often made because both involve beliefs that are seen as improbable, resistant to change, based on flawed reasoning, and potentially harmful to the individual or society. However, the entry cautions against drawing too simplistic a link. While both might involve a resistance to counter evidence, the reasons behind that resistance can be very different. For example, in marginalized communities, a distrust of official narratives and sources that fuels conspiracy beliefs might be a perfectly rational response to historical experiences of oppression or injustice. When it goes to how these beliefs form, some of the theories we discussed earlier, like the two-factor model and predictive coding, have also been applied to understanding belief in conspiracy theories, suggesting some potential overlap in underlying cognitive processes. However, others argue that no specific cognitive impairment is necessary to explain why people embrace conspiracy theories. And perhaps the most crucial distinction lies in their consequences. Delusions often lead to social isolation and impairment in daily functioning, whereas belief in conspiracy theories can sometimes foster social connections within like-minded groups, even though they can also lead to harmful actions.
So, while there might be some superficial similarities and perhaps some shared cognitive mechanisms, there are also important differences in terms of the social context, the motivations involved, and the overall impact on the individual and society. It sounds like drawing a clear line is really tough, but maintaining some distinction is still important, both for a clinical diagnosis and for understanding the nature of belief itself.
Absolutely. The Stanford entry ultimately concludes that while clear-cut distinctions are challenging, acknowledging the genuine areas of overlap can also be very insightful.
Well, I think we've successfully navigated this incredibly complex and fascinating terrain. To recap, delusions force us to re-examine our basic assumptions about belief, rationality, and the human mind. We've explored the ongoing philosophical debates about what a delusion actually is, the various theoretical attempts to explain how they arise, and the intriguing links between delusions and other more common forms of irrationality and belief. I think for our listeners, especially those interested in discussing this with a philosopher, this deep dive really emphasizes just how intricate and frankly how fragile our cognitive architecture can be. It's a constant dance between experience, belief, and reality, and sometimes that dance goes off in unexpected directions.
You said it, and it leaves us with this really thought-provoking question to ponder. If delusions, at their core, share some fundamental characteristics with the everyday irrational beliefs we all hold from time to time, where do we draw that line in the sand? What separates a strongly held, perhaps unconventional belief from a genuine break from reality? Is it simply a matter of the extremity, the impact of the belief, or is there a more fundamental difference in how these beliefs form and how they're maintained? This is a question that not only sheds light on the nature of mental health, but also invites us to examine the foundations of our own belief systems and how we navigate a world filled with uncertainty and conflicting information.
That's a powerful thought to end on. And of course, the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy entry is just the tip of the iceberg. It's packed with references and further avenues for exploration, from different types of delusions to the nuances of the various theoretical models. We encourage you to check it out and delve deeper into the works of the philosophers and researchers mentioned, folks like Maher, Coulthard, Bain, Bortolotti, and others. There's a whole world of fascinating and intellectually stimulating inquiry waiting for you. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.